case work.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm Ali Niknejad from UC Berkeley, Berkeley Wireless Research Center. A quick question about the fiber issue that you brought up, getting the backhaul. I mean, one of the beauties of millimeter wave technology is that you can also do the backhaul with the same spectrum. In fact, I've heard that in Europe, more than half of the existing 4G base stations are using wireless backhaul. So it'd be interesting to hear your comments on that.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Right, and so we've actually talked to several of the companies that are working on mesh backhaul solutions and self-provisioning small cells, which is fine, backhaul. So this is one of these questions where I think that the commercial economics will drive it. I think if you talk to carriers, or especially the companies that build out their infrastructure for them, everything else equal, you prefer fiber because its long run economics are better. The real question is just going to be how quickly can you get that fiber built out. So my best guess is that at least for a while, having the wireless backhaul option, so that you can see, if Verizon is your customer and they say we want our 4,000 new small cells turned on in 3 months. Whatever else happens, you can use in-band backhaul, or maybe you could use unlicensed 64, or there's lots of interesting options if you are the provider in that space. And then you can say, we can deliver it for you. Now, what you may do over time, because it'll improve your economics, is pull fiber through, and that'll be a function of where your network is and how expensive the local jurisdiction is. But from a regulatory standpoint, actually, I should have mentioned, so the FCC does have rules with regard to backhaul, and we used to call them fixed microwave services, just as the catch-all, but they're really backhaul rules. So it's our Part 101 rules. So we have a rulemaking underway as well, just to make sure that we don't have legacy rules in that category that get in the way of this. So, for example, some FCC rules have been on the books for a long time, and some categories of microwave rules have rules about how big the equipment can be, right? Because you go back 10, 15 years. So we're just looking for things like that where needlessly, is there some rule in the books that would actually get in the way of that kind of a deployment? We're trying to clean those up to create maximum ability for the business cases as they develop to be used.
Can you comment on worst-case electromagnetic exposure regulations for millimeter wave with the portable devices? Because it seems like a looming grand challenge.
Yeah. Well, so two things. I would actually defer that to Julie Knapp tomorrow, because the RF issues are certainly, we certainly hear lots of concerns about. I know it's an important research topic. I guess the one thing I would say is certainly some of the power levels talked about for the fixed deployments are pretty significant. But let me leave that for Julie tomorrow, because his bureau actually runs that research side for us.
My question is about auctioning of millimeter wave bands. So I'm from Europe, UK, and in the UK, the 700 megahertz was the reverse price was about 50 million pounds, which is roughly 20 million. Then 2.6 was a tenth of that. So what sort of order of magnitude do you think, given the huge amount of spectrum is going to be auctioned, you're considering? And also that in Europe the trend was that the 4G auction was much lower than 3G in terms of government revenue.
Sure. So that's one of these big questions, right? What's the long-term value of spectrum going forward, as clearly the supply is going to be growing? And whatever else is true, and it's not apples to apples, of course, for lots of reasons, but one little factoid that the chairman has used sometimes is, so spectrum frontiers of those 4 bands, 28, 37, 39, 64, that ended up being licensing rules for 11 gigahertz of spectrum, which is multiple times more than the FCC has ever made available for any service in history. Now, a megahertz is not a megahertz at 64 versus 600, but at some point, that supply-demand balance, how does it play out, clearly is going to lead to some different math for valuation. So the one thing I can observe is the companies that hold a lot of this spectrum, certainly right now the market is viewing the per megahertz pop for these millimeter waves at a tenth or less of kind of traditional low-band spectrum. So in the XO transaction, for example, net Verizon paid a couple $100 million for a nationwide 28 footprint. Now, in part, that reflects that it's much more speculative, right? It goes back to what I said around, for AT&T to buy spectrum to build out its next wave of LTE capacity, they know down to the last penny what that return looks like, and it's a massive established business model. These business models are less clear, and so that right there will affect the valuation some. The broader question of supply and demand and when will we have auctions relative to what deployment is, and if you were taking notes, I didn't actually say when I thought we'd have these auctions because it really is an FCC capacity issue. Right? This broadcast auction we're doing right now, it is the most complex thing we've ever done, and it absolutely is taking every single person in the FCC that knows how to do auctions. That's all we can do. So when that's done, we will then turn to what might be the next auctions. And so what happens next, 28, 39, 5, we haven't actually said. We're still thinking about it. And so I think that all of the math around who pays what for the spectrum probably based more on a sense of what the future growth opportunity is. I mean, it's not speculative, but it's much more of a forward-looking valuation model than Verizon figuring out what they want to pay for megahertz pop in Boston, for 800 megahertz spectrum that they're going to get from somewhere. So, don't know, although it's hard. If millimeter wave spectrum ends up costing as much as low band, people better grow their balance sheet some. But other than that, I think it remains just very, very interesting question, and we're going to make lots of interesting investment decisions based on that.
So there is some research evidence recently that sharing the spectrum between operators may be more efficient, though operators don't seem very keen about doing that. So what's FCC's position? Are you going to mandate the use of sharing? Are you going to go for exclusive allocation? Are you going to leave it to the economics or the market, the decision about what to do?
So in Frontiers Part 1, we quite purposefully did some of each. So 28 and 39, we made essentially traditional exclusive licenses, very, very aligned with the carrier model of we pay for an exclusive right and then we invest based on that long-term clear title, if you will. In lower 37, we did sharing, and in 64, we did unlicensed. So quite by design, we did some of each to try to create this maximum flexibility for the different models. I think. The points that I make on, this question of sharing and essentially what's the trade-off between clarity of investment versus future flexibility and entry, it's one of these just fundamental policy debates that the FCC always wrestles with. One observation I would have is, for some of these bands where there are federal allocations and federal rights, I don't think there's going to be a choice. I really think it's realistic to say we're just going to shut down a bunch of NASA satellites because commercial wants them. So by definition, you're going to be in a sharing regime for some of the spectrum if it's going to be used. And then the question of how that gets done, I think people will come to the table and figure that out. But where there's a choice, I think that's going to be one of the key things to watch as FCC policy leadership changes over is, on the margin, do we go more with sharing? Do we go more with exclusive? Because like I said, the overall push here on 5G millimeter wave will not slow down. But issues like that is where I think there's more policy uncertainty.
Okay. Tom Svensson, Chalmers in Sweden. In the race for 4G, we did a beauty contest. Maybe you know. Do you have any comments on that model? And the consequences of it? I don't know if it's reusable in 5G in Sweden, but yeah, do you have a comment?
Well, as I said, I think I follow in a long line of wireless bureau chiefs at the FCC and other senior staff that have definitely been advocates for. In the U.S., we do things differently. Right? We use auction. The beauty contest model used to exist in the U.S. long ago, but That has become a true bipartisan